So in your breakout rooms, you're free to talk however you like, in the knowledge that nothing is being recorded there. Only what you bring back to this room and report back to this room will be recorded. So let me hand over to Jan, who will introduce our panellists.
Great, thanks, Rory. Welcome to those who've just joined us, and welcome back to those who've been with us this morning. This morning we've been looking at new cooperativism and SDGs, or sustainability, and we've ranged a little bit around the subject areas. And some of that has overlapped with what we want to talk about today, which is around understanding co-op values and principles, and some of the challenges and applications going forward in terms of looking at that in a new cooperativism lens, if you like. So my name's Jan Myers. I'm here in capacity of being a member of UK Society for Co-operative Studies. And our two panellists today are Sonja Novkovic and Galera. Sonja is Professor of Economics at St Mary's University in Halifax in Canada, which is the home of the International Centre of Cooperative Management, and CARC, which is the Centre of Excellence in Accounting and Reporting for Cooperatives. She's also the chair of the ICA Committee on Cooperative Research, and the focus of her research has been on worker ownership and participation. She's currently involved in a 4-year development. She was involved in the development of the Co-op Index diagnostic tool for worker co-ops, and obviously a lot of that was linked to things around co-op identity. And she's now, I think, currently involved in a 4-year research project, which is funded by FWO Belgium, the Research Foundation, which is due to end in 2022, and that's looking at international cooperative governance. So again, another interesting area linked to co-op identity and internal values and principles, as well as external management. Amongst other topics, Sonja has also researched and written on defining cooperative difference and on cooperative principles and values. Guilia is senior researcher at EURICSI, which is the European Research Institute for Cooperative and Social Enterprise. Her research activities are focused on the role and potential of social enterprises in Central Eastern Europe, the concept of social enterprise and its legal evolution. And we will have a seminar later that looks at legal frameworks, but again, the extension of legal frameworks in certain countries links also to co-op identity and values and principles, and hopefully we might get to hear a little bit about that as well if we've got time. She's also looking at new typologies of cooperatives and innovative pathways for integrating asylum seekers and refugees, as well as the role of a social enterprise in building a proximity welfare system. She has also been involved in coordinating several European and international research projects, and is currently a member of the advisory board of 2 OEC projects, which are guidelines and good practices to develop legal frameworks of social enterprises and the social and solidarity economy from the margins to the mainstream. And a lot of what we were talking about in the first session around participation and involvement of communities and marginalised communities in particular will be of interest there as well. So we've got about 25 minutes of time for both our panellists to present and also to ask some questions before we take some of that presentation back into our groups to actually think about that in more detail and come back and ask some questions and stimulate and discuss some of the issues. So although the presentations are provocations in some way, they're also informative in terms of where each of our speakers are coming from and the key issues that they see linking to this topic. So I'm going to hand over to Guilia first, and then we'll follow up with Sonja.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you very much, Rory, for having invited me. It's a pleasure to be today here with you. So as recalled by the first speaker of this seminar series, Marcelo Vieta, cooperatives emerged in the 19th century as defensive reactions to the harsh conditions engendered by rural poverty and the Industrial Revolution. they were not simply economic institutions by then, they were also social institutions that recreated solidarity among groups of people. And by defending the interests of their members, cooperatives promoted the interests of the entire community. When compared to nowadays, cooperatives' goals and needs reflected, however, the higher degree of homogeneity of society. Over the decades, cooperatives have become extremely diversified according to their location and field of operation. So, focusing on Europe, in some countries, also as a consequence of the building of national welfare state systems, cooperatives have been confined in given fields of activity, such as consumption, credit, and have somehow lost part of their social commitment. In some cases, they have even evolved into entrepreneurial forms that differ from investor-owned enterprises exclusively due to their ownership rights, rather than by virtue of their social orientation. So in some countries, the aim of promoting only the interests of members was moreover crystallized as compulsory by national regulations. Conversely, in other regions, such as, for instance, Latin America, which was recalled before, many cooperatives have kept their strong social commitment. They have never, in a way, stopped pursuing the interests of the entire community and have also played the key political role of contributing to democratizing the economy. Recent political and social transformations that occurred over the past decades have provided cooperatives with new opportunities to reaffirm their ability to tackle social and economic concerns affecting local communities. In several countries, as it was already highlighted, new typologies of cooperatives have emerged. They are strongly rooted in forms of collective awareness, such as the need to promote social justice, protect the environment, as we have seen, support the social and professional integration of disadvantaged persons, and sustain the development of marginalized localities. I think I would recall three clusters of new cooperative typologies. Cooperatives that provide welfare services, for instance, educational services in Italy and health services in Japan. Cooperatives conceived as tools of social inclusion, for example, work integration cooperatives in many countries, such as, for instance, Poland, Greece, and again, Italy. And third, cooperatives as vehicles for local development, for instance, in Quebec and France. Based on the research that we have conducted over the past years, the revitalization of this community dimension of cooperatives is certainly expected to increase in importance of the future, given also the increasing complexity of society and the growing challenges ahead. So how do this new type of cooperatives differ from traditional ones? They differ, I believe, when it comes to the goals, the membership, and the resources they draw upon. As for the goal, their goal is not simply to promote the interest of their members, like, for instance, the one pursued by traditional consumer cooperatives, which is to minimize intermediation costs and retail prices, or the goal of agricultural cooperatives to increase the weak power of producers. The goal of these new typologies of cooperatives goes beyond the boundaries of cooperatives membership, and the motivation that pushes members to engage and undertake a particular activity is precisely the generation of collective benefits and or the promotion of the needs of vulnerable people. So this new type of cooperatives question the traditional model of membership of cooperatives, which is traditionally based on a single stakeholding system. Why? Because by definition, these new cooperatives tend to engage different typologies of actors, of people, interested in participating actively and having different relations with the cooperatives, workers, recipients, volunteers, in some cases also public authorities. Last but not least, given also the particular fields of general interest where these cooperatives are engaged, these cooperatives rely on a mix of resources, not only private market resources, but also public resources, public market resources, and non-economic resources, like, for instance, voluntary work. and community assets. So what should be done to reaffirm the collective awareness that, I will be very fast, that boosted cooperative success in the 19th century? To exploit cooperatives' full potential, I believe cooperative regulation should fully acknowledge the diverse role of cooperatives and permit cooperatives to operate in whatever industry in which they prove to be useful, which is not the case in all the countries. This includes sectors that benefit from public funding, have been traditionally public, and are of public interest. At the same time, and then I will close, to seize the opportunities offered by the current social and economic transformations that indeed call for participatory models of production and consumption, management practices that are more in line with cooperative values and principles should be adopted, in my view. In essence, cooperative pursuing explicit social aims should further strengthen their links with local communities.
We need to wind you up. You've
yes, and adopt inclusive governance models that allow for a fair representation of different stakeholders. Stop.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you, Guilia. I mean, there's a lot in there in terms of looking at both internal management and also what's happening practically in terms of community level and social movement co-ops and social co-ops sort of in different countries. I want to hand over to Sonja and then we can sort of follow up on both of those.
Yes, I will take us a little bit more literally into the topic, but I appreciate Julia's connection to the previous group where it really is all interlinked to me as well. So this is my 5 minutes. I'm gonna time myself and I'm hoping for broader conversations afterwards. So this is about updating co-op values and principles. And here is where I'm starting this conversation. I want to consider the intent of the process behind the ICA statement of 1995 and Ian McPherson's writing in 2012, where he described the process and the challenges and the debates. And so where they landed on after broad global conversations, they landed on the shared values, the 6+4, so the 10 values that you're all familiar with. And this was a global agreement. So the global cooperative movement agreed that these are the values that they share. They were less in agreement about the principles themselves, but they saw the values as leading into guiding the principles. So we landed on the 7 principles. These are the guides and they're general principles. And this is something that I don't think we're dwelling on enough at all. These are general principles. And what the group foresaw was that there would be additional operating principles to be developed by different types of co-ops. This is where we are. That has never been done, at least not deliberately and not to my knowledge. And this is the missing piece that is a continuation to 95 intent in my mind. So what are those additional operating principles? And the way that they were thinking about it, that they have to be different for different types of co-ops and for different cooperative purposes and for different cooperative contexts. And they almost say it's, you know, up to the co-op on the ground, a co-op, right? One co-op to figure out what its principles will be, but they're guided by the general principles, the 7. And so what we already know and what we're already seeing is that Mondragon has developed 10 because, you know, their context is labor matters first and foremost. And so you have, you know, that what Mondragons are, but it's all about work and sovereignty of labor and capital being instrumental, but not the boss and so on. Then there is the Global Alliance for Banking of Values that includes more than co-ops. It's not just cooperatives, but those who are co-ops in the group abide by Global Alliance for Banking of Values principles. And among them is the key principle that we're not talking about in financialization of the economy, which is that they are financing the real economy and they measure that. Okay, everybody else is running away from that. Agricultural co-ops who care and who are radical are actually abiding by the principles of agroecology. And I think this is where we live in today's conversation about sustainability, because when you look at the principles of agroecology, it's all of the above. And well, sorry, not all of the above, apparently Julia is going on, but there's a lot in it, okay? So anyway, but this is, I think, is where we need to discuss and debate. And then again, it's context specific. And then there are others. There's specific purpose in fair trade and the principles of fair trade and so on. So these are just some of those principles in Global Alliance and the agroecology. And I will quickly go through them to not lose my time there. But in agroecology, we're talking about diversity, synergies, resilience, recycling, co-creation, sharing of knowledge, human social values, and the last but not least is circular and solidarity economy. So, so all of that is within the agroecological principles. This is from Ian, and I just want to point to the bolded bits. They're thinking back then in 95. That it's up to each local co-op to work out how the general principles apply and given their situation to figure out what operating principles fit them, that they are open for renegotiation pretty much every 30 years. And this is where we are right now. And it's because new generation of leaders is emerging and because certain economic, political, social major shifts happen. And we are seeing some of those shifts, of course. And then that the impact of the values is critical. They're open-ended. They can only be the guides, and that those values actually will grow as cooperatives and cooperatives strive to live their values more completely. So that's from Ian. To me, the conversation about new cooperativism this is what I'm pondering about. What is special about new cooperativism? How new is really new? So I'm happy to see that Marcelo is pulling us back into more radical roots rather than saying we're now reinventing the wheel. How new is new, and what is new about it is what we need to ponder a little bit more as researchers, I think. Is it new only in some cultural contexts? Is it where consumer co-ops have dominated and single member type co-ops have dominated, that this is becoming a news? In many contexts, multi-stakeholdership is alive and well, has been as long as co-ops have been around, and they just don't have a law that calls it that. But then we have legal structures that allow multi-stakeholdership, starting from Italy and moving on. Now we're rediscovering that as a new model. It isn't. We have German co-ops that are multi-stakeholder. We have Croatian and former Yugoslav co-ops that are multi-stakeholder, and on it goes, right? And these are the ones I know. There's plenty that I don't know. In the context of indigenous communities in the Canadian North, my goodness, they're multi-purpose, multi-stakeholder, you name it. So is the statement as it is, statement on the cooperative identity, problematic in any way for new co-op developments? And what's bothering us? We need to identify what is not there, right? And can we interpret what's there that suits the purpose of what it is we're trying to accomplish? And to me, the last but not least, is this newness so that we can give voice to capital? And if that's the case, then we have a Trojan horse as far as I'm concerned. So that's where I would like us to kind of dwell on it.
Thanks, Sonja. I mean, I think there's a real interesting challenge there for us to actually think about in the groups in terms of both newness and return to roots, or return to a different looking at roots as new organisational forms are appearing, or different kind of forms coming out of social movements and how people are interpreting them. And I think that's really quite interesting. So that kind of leads to one of my sort of high level questions in terms of, we're talking about the principles need to be, or some people are talking about the need to revise the principles and values. And as you say, it was always open to revision every 25, every 30 years. But what's in there and what you've pointed to, and this kind of fits also with what Julia was talking about different legal environments allowing different kinds of things to happen, is the operating principles, and that they're different for each of the sectors, and the types of organisations are in there. So if you were looking at the principles in terms of fit, is there a need for a hierarchy of principles that we're often told about, like the first four principles are the ones that define the co-op identity, whereas with the social movements we've got more emphasis on education and community embeddedness? So I'm throwing that up to you in terms of how might those principles be looked at in terms of the context that we're talking about now. Sonja, do you want to follow up with that, because you were talking about that very much, and then Julia?
Yeah, I can take it. I know from everything we've read and seen and discussions we've had that the 7 principles are not meant to be split apart and categorized and prioritized. That it's the whole package, that the whole statement on the cooperative identity, the definition of what a cooperative is, with the values that they've agreed on and the principles that follow. That whole thing is what matters. However, legal systems and legal frameworks usually go for the tree. They don't dwell on how are you going to live by your remaining 4, because it's difficult to, how do you make sure what is care for community? And many credit unions in Canada will tell you, oh, they care for community, they give them a lot of money. And that's where they stop, right? So, do they not care for community? I guess you can always argue that they do. So anyway, so this is not what entered legal frameworks, and it's problematic in many ways, right? It's difficult. So I wouldn't prioritize them personally. I would say it's all of the above. And since I live, like many of you, in education spaces, what we have on our hands is to educate managers of co-ops and decision makers in co-ops that they do have the 7 and the values, and they need to think how to operationalize that, and that there is a broader community to worry about, right? So this is what the education piece is doing to the old co-ops, but the new co-ops start probably from, radical ideas or new ideas or care for community. Anyway, I'll stop. I'm sure Julia has a lot to add.
I mean, Ian Adley's raised an interesting point in chat just there in terms of is it principles or is it guidelines? And you have both talked about guidelines in that sense. Julia, I mean, following on from that in terms of the different contexts, I mean, you were particularly sort of concerned around the evolution of the cooperative form, not necessarily the legal structure, but the different cooperative forms that are coming into view, and whether or not they have been disruptive in their focus on that commitment to social and community. And you've provided some examples of that. Can you provide some additional examples maybe that sort of link and describe that a bit more?
Sure. I think that so we know that cooperative development is an ongoing process. So it's a natural evolution in a way, because cooperatives are very flexible organizations that respond to needs of either specific stakeholders or of the whole community. So it is obvious that they must reflect also the change in needs that occur in society. But if we look at the new type of cooperatives, depending on the country and its regulations, the emergence of these new typologies has in some cases required a dramatic change in, I would say dramatic, but a very strong change in legislation, or it has occurred naturally. In Italy and France, new regulations were introduced, which recognized in Italy in 1991 a new type of cooperative, social cooperative, which was mentioned by Michele. In France, a revision of cooperative law enabled to introduce a new form of cooperative, the SIC, the Société Coopérative d'Intérêt Collectif, which pursues the interest of the community and must obligatorily include in its membership 3 typologies of stakeholders. And in Germany, the revision of the 2006 Cooperative Society Act has put new type of cooperatives with a social aim or cultural aim at the same level of traditional cooperatives. And these cooperatives manage, for instance, village shops in remote depopulated areas. So previously in Germany, cooperatives pursuing goals other than the economic interest of their members were not admitted by law. Nevertheless, if we look at other countries, like for instance, northern countries such as Sweden and Finland, but also Japan, so the legal system does not pose obstacles to cooperatives that decide to take on new responsibilities. And so the emergence, for instance, in Japan of health cooperatives has not been as much disruptive as in Italy, where there has been a very long discussion with the engagement of the cooperative movement, and there was the need to introduce a new regulation, which actually is revolutionary, because it moves from the aim of promoting the members to the aim of promoting the interest of the community. And this was a very big change in our country.
Yeah.
Can I add to this? Because in the work that's being done with the ILO on these cooperative statistics, what appeared is the following, that there are really 4 types of co-ops. And And there are a million types of socially defined co-ops. So we have youth co-ops, we have women's co-ops, we have YZs, we have veterans co-ops in Croatia, for example. You name it. So it's a social construct and a political construct in many contexts. But really, it's either who are the members? Is it workers? Are they producers or self-employed? Are they consumers, or are they a multi-stakeholder type? So that's what we landed on, the 4, right? But then legal frameworks are, oh my goodness, and this is the challenge, that national statistics are impossible really in many contexts, because they don't quantify them, or they don't qualify them by the 4, but they really go into the purpose that they serve. So you're right, that purpose that they serve, there will be energy co-ops, and the legal frameworks treat them differently, regulators treat them differently, and this is the complication, of course, the complexity of it all. But do we as researchers call them new cooperativism, or do we not, is what I think we need to think about.
Yeah. And whether that takes away from the actual focus in terms of what we're looking at in a general way. Yeah, definitely. We need to move into groups. I mean, one of the things that I'll just throw out there as well, though, just before we go, was one of the things Sonja was saying about what co-operators have, either, sort of practitioners rather than researchers, if you like, have on their hands, or in their hands, are the practice guidelines. So if we're looking at how those work in practice, how do we engage co-operators and practitioners and people on the ground who are running the organisations into thinking of how we look at these new or extended or merged principles, or whatever we're talking about as well? So maybe that's something we could come back to at the end. But what I'd like to do is ask Rory to move us into groups, to actually maybe just think there's a lot of stuff coming out of there. So sort of think about some of the things that you might think need to be expanded on, or reflected on, or actually challenged in that sense too.
Okay, so the breakout rooms will be random. I'll create breakout rooms with hopefully 5 in each. Sonja, Julia, I can't stop it issuing you an invitation, but if you decline the invitation, you can stay in the main room and we will have our own conversation with Jan. So we'll form our own breakout room, if that makes sense. Yeah. So everybody else, you should get an invitation any second now. You should get your invitation now.
And we'll call you back in about 20 minutes.
Yes. Yeah. So thanks, folks. That was quite dynamic.
I'm saying if we both speak like this, that's why it's dynamic.
Yeah, with hands. I'm Italian. I can't help. I mean, this is the way I am.
No, it's very good that. We're still recording, by the way. So this
that's okay.
Okay.
That's good. It was interesting, and Sonja and I had a little exchange in the chat, and you alerted to it. This issue of whether it's really new or not. I think it's a call for rediscovery and renewal, isn't it?
Yeah.
It sort of reminds me of some of Chris Cornforth's work about the fact that worker co-ops don't always degenerate, that they can sometimes refresh and renew when they hit a crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's also like the underlying message of quite a lot of the stuff around community development and commons and stuff isn't new. It is around reinterpreting that and reusing that in the context that we are. And I think we get stuck on new versus old, or good versus bad. It's this, it's this 2 legs good, 4 legs bad sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I have to say that in Italy, if we look at social cooperatives, they're also very, let's say, traditional social cooperatives that I wouldn't describe them as new and as innovative, as connected with social movements at all.
No.
So there is not just one trend, which is, there is a huge diversity and variety of situations and of evolution of individual cooperatives, which needs to be taken into account. But of course, we also as researchers must highlight the contradictions, the obstacles that hamper the emergence of new cooperatives and the development of cooperatives, the evolution of cooperatives towards a stronger social responsibility. So, of course, we must look at the regulations, because sometimes the regulations prevent this, and they are a very big obstacles.
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, you know, speaking about the single stakeholder or single member type, I know that some cooperatives here in the province of Nova Scotia have in fact created new cooperatives with a different stakeholder group, because by law they have to be a single stakeholder, right? Yeah. But then they actually support each other. And so they created it so that they can get support from this new, instead of, you know, bringing them into multi-stakeholdership, they actually created the independent entities that are networked.
Which is what was being talked about, that about the intercooperation, the co-op. I mean, it's principle 6, isn't it, in terms of cooperation between co-ops, rather than being merged.
But
I had a fascinating conversation with 2 people from Fairbnb, because they've established themselves in Bologna as a worker co-op with 66% voting power for the workforce and 33% power for their sort of investment supporters, I suppose. They do have voting power, but they want to extend membership to what they call their ambassadors, the people who localize and do it. And so we were looking at sort of an internal council, an internal multi-stakeholder council, but we also talked about like a co-op of ambassadors that then joins in a European co-op with So there's more than one way that you can bring around the multi-stakeholding.
But you know, 2 years ago, with a group of friends, we have set up a labor cooperative in Lombardia, which is aimed at integrating to work migrants, so asylum seekers and refugees. And we couldn't register as a social cooperative because migrants are not disadvantaged workers formally. So we registered as a worker cooperative, and we would not have been allowed if we didn't have a social enterprise legislation in Italy, because we engaged in our group. I'm volunteer because I have another job, but there are, of course, workers, and there are, let's say, investors who also participate in the membership. And we were able to develop, to emerge as a labor cooperative, because we have the qualification of social enterprise. Otherwise, we would not have been allowed to have volunteers. And this is absurd. But as a labor cooperative, you are only accepted to have workers. Yes. So, but I have another job and I wanted to participate. So we, after months of studying, of analysis, cost-benefit analysis about a different legal solution, we ended up establishing a labor cooperative, a worker cooperative with a social enterprise qualification. But
and this is why you need cooperative developers to set up co-op, because they know the ropes. If you just leave it to any old lawyer.
No, please, no, lawyers, no.
It's a problem, for sure. It's a problem.
But it's a problem because there are not experts whatsoever that are able really to support, I think, new groups, new voluntary groups, or new groups of people, community groups that are interested in setting up new cooperatives. The support we gained from the local federation of cooperatives was really crap. I wouldn't have to say that. I wouldn't have to say that. But, and I'm talking as a person who studies cooperatives. So I'm also privileged because I can count on the support of my colleagues. But what about a group of people who have no experience and no contacts? So how many cooperatives are we missing?
Yes.
Yeah, or who are told to set up as something else. I mean, that's the key thing, isn't it? You know, so you get so many organisations who want to actually do something, but they find that they can't because they've, like in the UK, they've registered as something else, and that prevents them doing what they want to do because they've not had the advice that says, well, what is it that you want to do? Do you want to engage with, you know, sort of a multi-stakeholder, or do you want to be able to raise money from sort of this kind of stuff?
I still think that this disciplinary area is about, it's about how you shift a multitude of configurations and legal structures in the direction of the cooperative movement. It's
of what's happening.
This is what I think is what Julia's talking about. And I know, Sonja, we've had a whole dinner evening over because in some countries, I mean, you've got lovely relatively benign legislation for multi-stakeholder co-ops in Quebec and across other parts of Canada, which we don't have elsewhere. I mean, I didn't realize how much I would struggle to get protection for the member groups when we went through the FCA in the UK. So we've got a real fudge, but we have done something that is legally defensible, which is to have a stakeholder council that has real power, but that stakeholder council could be removed by the General Assembly. I mean, it's not ideal. It has a specific power to protect the position of different member groups within the co-op.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And as I said, I mean, because of, you know, the Yugoslav history, I mean, in Croatia, you just set up a co-op, and anybody who wants to support the purpose of the co-op can be a member.
Yes.
And so you have a co-op of, you know, urban planners who have architects, urban planners, journalists, and I don't even know what the other community member is, but they all pay their dues and they all support the purpose of the co-op, which is quite radical. And so, you know,
can I ask a question that both of you might be able to answer, which is, when we were in Canada, in Montreal, for the ICA conference last time, presented a paper on the classification of co-ops, which you talked about the four. And I went in search of that as a working paper of, because he sent it to me as a working paper of Syriac or Sycopa. I can't remember which.
Syriac, it would be Syriac probably, yeah. It's on the ILO.
Yeah, I couldn't find it in the list of working papers. So what has that classification stalled or gone forward, or what's
gone forward? There are the guidelines on cooperative statistics that have been built, but it's on the International Labor Organization's website, ILO Co-op.
Okay, that's good.
Sorry, it should be ILO Co-op, and now Marie put out a book based on it, and it's also free online there.
Marie Paredo?
No, Marie Bouchard.
Bouchard. Okay, thank you.
Marie Bouchard, and because it was Marie Bouchard and Syriac International that were involved in this, it's under the Syriac banner, right?
I mean, just going back to the principles and values and stuff. I mean, the examples you gave there around Mondragon having their 10 principles, or, you know, sort of stuff like that, and that's, I mean, what's been shown over a period of time is that when you talk to co-ops and you ask them about the ICA principles, they don't know what they are, or they know some of them and not others. So, I mean, this is the thing around, well, you know, yes, they're there as a background support, but where do they link in with what organisations are actually doing for themselves? Where are they talking to each other? Otherwise, ICA principles are going to be stuck there, aren't they? Unless we get the review of those and the Mondragons and the others. But even small co-ops, you look at them and they've got their own set of guiding principles, not always linked to SDGs, but linked to what they want to do locally in their locality and with the groups that they're working with. And they're just as legitimate because they can measure what they're doing against those. They can evaluate what they're doing. Yeah. And I just wonder about that kind of relationship, really.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in the ICA membership in some way or another, you live under a rock if you haven't heard of the principles. You know, so I don't know of co-ops these days. It may have been that way nowadays, but you're right that they may not know them all or understand, but this general understanding of we are a co-op seems to live there. But I like, I think Roger wrote about that, this ideal type of co-op. There are two and not one. And the first one being financial benefit, you know, the market failure kind and really financial benefit to members. And the other, the one we were talking about. So even there, understanding of why are you, as Rory actually in the chat in the last session wrote, it depends on why members got together. So, you know, if they got together so they can share costs, and many do, or scale up, then that's going to be their concern. And the question then is, how do you educate them? How do you push that a little bit beyond? And how do you, you know, so there's the education piece. But then others were attracted to the nature of cooperatives and so on. So it's a complex space. I don't know what to say. I mean, but the ICA's job is to educate its membership and to have these debates. And they try. I don't know how successfully necessarily, right? But that's what they're doing. This whole Congress this year is about that.
I was going to say that I think there is a lack in education and in awareness of many cooperatives about the cooperative principles. And this is also somehow I think, confirmed by the tendency of many cooperatives of mimicking traditional enterprises. So they are not very much aware of their added value, of their specificity. And so they tend to be fascinated by trends or by things that are not by, let's say, by, for instance, tools and models that are not really capable of strengthening their capacity to capture new needs or their capacity to promote democratic management models. So I can see this perfectly in Italy now, not only as a researcher, but also as a cooperator, and I fight against this.
I think that's where I was coming from with that last throw-in question about, you know, what tools can we help with or give to, or what people can use to actually transition organisations, or do the kinds of things that you're saying, actually put things into practice.
Will the SORP help? The cooperative SORP?
It can't be. Well, it's difficult because it can't be international in that sense. So it'd be up to local interpretation.
The group at CARC. I mean, I think one of our
Maureen is working on SORPs, right?
Maureen have got some funding in the UK to create working groups here, and then I know that Maureen argued that the international SORPs for charities was triggered by the adoption of the SORP in the UK. In other words, other countries then began to follow suit once one country had convinced the IFSA that you could have a charity SORP. So, but I don't know whether the conversation has gone, whether it's heading in the direction of the SDGs or whether it's heading back towards co-op values and principles.
I think it's back to co-op values and principles. I don't think they're mixing the two as far as I know, but I may be wrong. But it's fascinating. I mean, Jen, what you're saying, so there are two attempts. So to me now, looking again back at what I was saying, Ian's work, do these general principles need some revamping, right? And so there is clearly the operationalizing the principles bit that we're missing. And again, not we, all of us, but as I said, Mondragon has them and others do. But the question is there anything missing in the general principles? And there was a push from Latin America to include environment as a separate principle so that it's really prominent. Although you can argue that it is in the values, it even uses the word sustainability, and it's about care for communities and sustainable communities, and it's coming from this concern. But Ian is writing in his piece that that's where it's coming from. But the one that's being pushed now is DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion. And that's on the table for this Congress because Americans are pushing that one. And it should be a general principle I think it's not, it shouldn't be context specific. It should be everybody's concern. So this is going to come in.
I think it would be.
And I think that's, sorry, Rory.
I was going to say, I get the sense that solidarity needs, further definition.
Again, if you're a worker co-op, you know what solidarity is about, and nobody in a consumer co-op is going to accept that.
It's really difficult.
So what is solidarity?
We've legitimized solidarity based around the common bond of a member group, but we haven't legitimized solidarity between member groups.
Right.
That's what would be.
Well, in practice, I think it does in multi-stakeholdership. Again, we, being from a multi-stakeholder school board, we definitely were fighting as consumers for the pay for workers that should be higher, even though it meant that we should pay more, right? So you have that solidarity if labor is in the mix. But
it might be interpreted locally. I'm just thinking, has it been interpreted from the movement's perspective as to?
It's really. I recommend everybody read that chapter. It's brief from Ian. I think it's fascinating. He says that all of this was hashed out and talked about, and different movements, different social movements were unhappy with the final outcome. People who were advocating for movements were not happy with the outcome and whatever. So I think it's really interesting, but we need to talk about it.
And I think it's also important that we talk about one of the things that was mentioned a couple of times was about the tick box exercise with the SDGs. And it seems to me that, you know, that care for community has been pushed further and further down that route of that tick boxing exercise in that. And the other aspects of the social movement stuff, the solidarity stuff, have been forgotten. Not forgotten, but, you know, sort of not as prominent in terms of what that is.
I think we should reflect, and the cooperative principles should in a way incorporate also this aspect better of diversity, as it was mentioned, which is, I think, not sufficiently clear. Whereas I would say that the 7th principle captures also solidarity with new generations. So in a way, the SDGs should be somehow included, but maybe made more explicit. Maybe it should be better operationalize the principles so as to highlight how can we in a way actualize them, adjust them to the changing conditions of, because now we have a pandemic, we have an environmental crisis which was not as severe when in 1995 when the 7th principle, for instance, was introduced. So it was very revolutionary, the 7th principle. Now it seems obvious to have such a principle.
Mm-hmm. On SDGs, I'm contributing to some work from Unraised on this, and it is Unraised, the Institute for Social Development. Yeah. And what they're doing is looking at social solidarity economy and how it can inform SDG indicators. Mm-hmm. And there I see the space that cooperatives can be the leaders. If they don't think, oh, here's a package, how do we take it and adapt it? Mm-hmm. But rather, how do we push the envelope and push the agenda into what we really want to do? So the radicalized version of it. And so I'll give you one example, that an indicator of highest to lowest pay differential, social indicator, right? Yeah. Highest to lowest pay differential is normal and natural to co-ops, but corporations really, don't want to touch it. And these indicators that they're developing are for everybody. So for any kind of enterprise, but it's informed by what the purpose of social solidarity economy is. And there are plenty of those that we can actually, I'm just finishing a paper for CIRIEC on that. There's plenty of areas where we can be the leaders in this space rather than just adopt SDGs and say, as a package, yes, the intent of SDGs, absolutely, but specifics are a little bit trickier.
But also, I think it would be very important in a way to penalize those cooperatives. And I was thinking before when you were presenting at many agricultural cooperatives, which use so many pesticides, but so many pesticides that it's just not acceptable, not acceptable. So I think cooperatives also need rules. Yeah. To make sure that they effectively contribute to
powers in the constitution for members to hold the cooperative to those rules. That's crucial. The pressure. One thing was interesting. Tony Webster is one of our historians. He said what was so powerful about the early days of the UK retail co-op movement was the power that members had over their co-ops to hold them to serving member interests.
Interesting.
Yes, and that was.
And that changed, then.
Yes, it was lost in the sort of reorganization post World War II. That's what he argued.
Yeah,
interesting.
But it was also the power of the retail over the wholesale as well.
Yes. Yes.
And using that power to actually move away from the co-op wholesale to actually buy from private providers. So
and that's also a little bit. I mean, for someone who is in love with cooperatives, it means that many consumer cooperatives have not been really able to adjust themselves also to the new request of some consumers who are asking for a different attention to local products. And so we can see this fully in Italy.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to close the rooms now. So that was a good discussion.
We're back.
Have we got everybody back? I think we have, more or less. Great. Well, I hope you've had good discussions in your groups. I think we've got 4 groups, so that should hopefully allow a reasonable amount of feedback and discussion from each of the groups. So perhaps if I just sort of pick a number, I don't know, do you know your group numbers? No, okay. Maybe somebody wants to raise a hand then from one of the groups to actually do the initial feedback.
Sorry, I can tell you if you like.
Oh.
So group 1 was Anna, Francesca, Ian, Marco and Matt.
Mind feeding back unless anybody else really wants to. We talked about some of the challenges that are sometimes faced when you start talking about changing the principles. There's almost a kind of knee-jerk opposition to, well, no, those are the principles, and that how dare anybody sort of question them, can be the knee-jerk reaction people sometimes face. We heard about some of the challenges that people have faced trying to set up things like multi-stakeholder cooperatives and how that translates. One of the other aspects is in terms of the definition. The definition is a minimum standard that people have to meet to be a cooperative, a minimum statement, and actually, when it comes to the principles, is there something about pulling out of the principles the things that are actually principles, and then pushing into operational guidance the bits that are actual operational guidance? Principle 3 in particular, half of that is operational guidance about what to do with money. Some of it is quite hardwired underlying principles that everybody's recognised. So it's a little bit about the importance of the definition and linking back to that and how that feeds through into the work. And then there was some debate and discussion as well around the kind of the solidarity aspects, the movement building aspects within cooperatives, and what's the best way of doing that, where if you've got a small housing co-op that doesn't want to release its funds to develop another housing co-op because its members are happy and don't want to do that, and the kind of the balance and interdependence between principles around education and concern for community and cooperation with cooperatives, and how those start to interbalance along with the voluntary nature of it and the democratic control aspects, and how those are all reconciled. So they're the sort of things we discussed.
Oh, great, thanks. I mean, some of those I think also will fit back into a later seminar that we're looking at. We'll be able to look at them again from the legal aspect as well, I guess, Ian, and that's your area too, which will be useful. So I can take that. Are there any comments on the issues that Ian's raised in terms of similarities in other groups, or do you want to take us forward in terms of what you were talking about in your groups as well? Group 2.
Group 2 was Alex, David, Elizabeth, Mary and Maureen.
I don't mind going if colleagues are
Right, go on, Alex, you go.
Right. We didn't really choose what to talk about. We started off fairly general. I gave them an interesting discussion on glazing greenhouses, which was fortunately stopped by David. But the main thing that we got onto really was talking about autonomy, and how in particular some legal systems force government into multi-stakeholder co-ops as part of their creation. But principally we talked about credit unions in Wales in particular, and I mentioned our 2009 report, Jan. I still have a copy on the bookcase.
Shameless promotion, Alex, shameless promotion.
Yeah, but collective promotion. About how we looked at credit unions and how grant dependent they were, and identified quite clearly the fact they weren't seeing themselves as businesses. And we also talked about the fact how in many ways they don't always see themselves as co-ops. Certainly in the UK, they see themselves as credit unions. They don't regard the co-op values and principles as really applying to them. They think they're somehow different and separate, and how to such a large extent they've become grant dependent. And that's partly the support that they've got from Welsh government, but they've had support from local authorities. They've had the Growth Fund, of course, and other funds since that have really latched them onto government poverty programs. And they don't, unlike the Irish credit unions, they don't see themselves as something for everyone. They see themselves as this poor person's bank, which fundamentally weakens them. And they because they've only got poor customers, then they can't be self-sustaining. And they end up being totally grant dependent. So we saw that, and that same thing applies in social enterprises. Social enterprises, which we didn't talk about, social enterprises lack democracy, but they also, most of them, because their definition of up to 50% of income coming in from the state, means that they are very, very often quite strongly grant dependent too. So autonomy we saw as really the important principle that we ended up talking about.
Oh, interesting. Any other comments from
one other comment maybe in relation to, we discussed about this interchangeable use between principles and guidelines, and we did have an opinion that, you know, the importance of the use and the retention of the word principle, because it has a much greater meaning in the sense that it's about a principled way of doing business as well, as we would typically associate it with, and that by interchangeably using with the idea of guidelines means it can be, you can choose to be in or out of guidelines. You know, you can take the guidelines or you don't, whereas we felt that principles reinforce the importance that these are the principles we adhere to. And
how would that fit with what Ian was saying about differentiating within the principles between what is a principle and what is an application, if you like?
Yeah, well, I think what we did highlight was that sometimes that principle of concern for community, which I think Ian was talking about, is not very widely illustrated in some of the examples we were talking about. And then Maureen had mentioned that perhaps maybe looking at some of the larger credit unions in Canada would give us a better illustration of how those type of credit unions really do have a demonstrable effect on their communities and how they engage with it.
I would just add that for me, principles have within them a DNA of ethics, an ethical approach. And that's why principles are, I think the principles is a better way of actually communicating who we are and what we're about. I think accountability also seems to me to be something that is lost in many quarters. And I touched at the end, but we didn't really have a proper discussion about how best we can actually infiltrate and influence state-funded education curricula so that there's more than cooperators using their limited resources to increase understanding and knowledge of the movement. And we've been thinking carefully in the context of the Robert Owen 250th anniversary activities that we've been running during May, which you can see details of on our website, about how we could move to the next stage of working with young people in having a competition with some good prize money around them starting up a cooperative community newspaper, so that there were various themes would be identified, such as sustainable development goals, such as Robert Owen's legacy. But the idea is that we would leave it fairly loose and open for people to join us on that journey and report by May of next year. So it'd be nice to actually communicate with or share with others how they've been tackling infiltration, influencing of the education system. Thank you, Chair.
And I know from the UK point of view, it's something that the new CEO of Co-ops UK is quite interested in terms of looking at sixth form, particularly curriculum development in terms of introducing co-op stuff.
One of the different, mind you, infiltration sounds a bit militaristic, doesn't
it? No, well, maybe we need to be very well organised and determined and patient. One of the difficulties we have with Co-ops UK is that essentially it's an English organisation. And you've got to recognise differences in policy and legislation between England and Wales. I mean, it doesn't matter what Gove and Johnson are trying to do in undermining devolution with the internal market bill and so on. But the education system is quite distinct. And if you come at it through an English prism, you'll get lost and you'll lose all credibility. So what needs to happen is that Co-ops UK need to have a conversation with educationalists in Wales and support us in what we're actually trying to do. Rather than them briefing us on what they're doing.
I think that reminds us that it isn't just UK centric, and we've got European and other examples from around the world. And actually, Julia was talking about the legislative frameworks of different countries that inhibit or support different kinds of cooperative venture as well, in that sense too.
And Martin's mentioned Scotland, but I also refer to Northern Ireland
Scotland,
as well.
Yeah. Yeah, Anna says that infiltration could be subversive, not just militaristic. So yeah, I like that. Subverting or disrupting, I think was Julia's word as well. Any other comments from that particular group, or should we move forward to the next group?
Room 3 was Alexei,
Thank you.
Darren, and Grant and Raphael.
Yeah, so I can say something and the others have to correct if I misremember. So basically our take in the discussion on updating co-op values and principles was that it's important to maybe start, so we had a bit of an educational context, I think, is to ask people what their values and principles are rather than asking them if they like the co-op principles and if they're interesting. And not because we think they're not interesting, but because it could be interesting to have a conversation about the values that people have and the principles and go that way. And I guess one aspect here was that this might be resonant, especially with the millennial generation, where you have studies that they have this resonance. So it could be a more empowering way of talking about the values rather than, you know, saying there is this set that somebody came up with. And the other topic I think we touched on was the problem of kind of hegemony of different values. Again, in an education context where maybe there's a lot of being told what's supposed to be an enterprise and supposed to be a leader and what are the kind of values that come with that. So that it is interesting to see what are formats to challenge that, or even Alexei is working for how to communicate cooperative possibilities for disadvantaged communities in Nova Scotia. What are maybe, Daryl said there, what are the right labels to even introduce the topic, and that it's not misperceived perhaps right from the start as what this is all about. So that's the kind of discussion we had on the topic.
Good. Alexei or other members of the group, do you want to come in on that and add to that? Or?
I would just say that I've brilliantly summarised, Raphael. I can't really, there's not really much more to say other than I think it was just the power of participation really in developing principles and values from the ground up. So literally, so if you were, for example, from a startup business and you said, what form should we take? And just started from the members, let's call it, or the participants developing your principles and values, the power of actually having that as the start point, as opposed to saying, should we take on a social enterprise or cooperative principles and values, and then a bit like I think it was I think Maureen mentioned to me earlier about the cooperative index identity tool, that kind of, you know, afterwards then starting to think about whether there's a good fit on that, because it comes, if I come at it from a finance or accounting perspective, that we all know that whether it's a budget, a forecast, a strategy, or mission or vision, the moment you get involve people from the beginning, from the ground up, things are much more likely to work and to be accepted than if you just say, listen guys, we're just going to buy in these principles and values and hopefully you'll engage with them. So that's pretty much one element of it.
And that they're a live topic. They're there to be looked at and reviewed and revised, not just put on the shelf in that sense as well. Yeah. Did anyone look at the thing that Sonja was talking about in terms of I've forgotten what I was going to say now on that one. But in terms of looking at how things can be interpreted in terms of the actual different organisations and how they're developing. Did anybody look at that kind of thing? I know we've looked at context, but on a more local ground.
So we discussed it briefly, because I think the ILO's work on legislation uses the phrase associative characteristics when looking at a cooperative. So we talked about examples of, yeah, how open is open membership in a worker cooperative, and what does that actually mean in practice? You know, it doesn't mean that everyone can walk up and demand to be a worker and a member. Yeah, there's what's an acceptable probation period, etc. Likewise, cooperatives restricting membership on gender. Is it appropriate in a cooperative looking at, I don't know, women refugees versus a working men's club? And those two different examples, in one context deemed fine, in another not, quite justifiably so. But looking at those associative characteristics of what's the cooperative, not only what type of cooperative it is in terms of its members, but also what's it trying to do, and looking at the guidelines, the principles, the definitions through that associative characteristic lens. Generally been quite useful.
I wouldn't mind chipping in here within the FairShares world. There's a book brought out by Graham Boyd and Jack Reardon, which differentiates what they call vanilla FairShares to what they call a FairShares Commons. So they introduce specific values around intergenerational solidarity and the creation of commons beyond an intellectual commons. So the original FairShares argued for an intellectual commons. They want commons to be managed that go well beyond that, and actively creating commons resources. But they also recognise that commons don't necessarily mean a public commons, that the commons may be open to members but not beyond the membership. But of course the membership model is very open. It's much more open than the single stakeholder co-ops that we talked about.
What about the issue of newness that was raised, has been raised several times as well? And I'm thinking here again, Rory, about maybe your paper where you're talking about, is new cooperativism progress or regress? And we heard in the last session about returning to the roots of cooperativism in many respects. So, and Sonja was talking about this as well. Did this come up for folks? Did you rise to look at that challenge?
Group 4 are asking to do their feedback. We forgot to give this.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Group 4.
Group 4 was Catalina, Dong, Martin, and Pat.
I mean, I'm happy to have an initial go and then others can follow. So we had a very productive and stimulating discussion, though not particularly structured. And the 3 points I would draw out of it, but as I say, the others may wish to come in separately, is first of all, we talked about trust as being essential to a successful cooperative. It's not kind of mentioned anywhere in that word, but I always think of trust as being the glue that binds a cooperative together. If there isn't trust among the members, then it doesn't have a very long-term future, is subject to management capture, etc., etc. Secondly, we talked about, which comes back to the first session, about scaling up and the importance of looking at federative and other solutions in terms of just one cooperative growing bigger, and also that being a voluntary process that, for instance, in Mondragon, on a couple of occasions, co-ops have actually chosen to leave Mondragon, chosen to go different ways. So it has to be voluntary, as the principles of fact state. And finally, the balance between Julia's emphasis, this was very much around like community, aspect, dimension, and so on. And we talked about trying to achieve a balance between self-interest and community interest, that the self-interest of members is actually quite important, and that without understanding self-interest, you don't necessarily get the motivation. If members feel that their self-interest is entirely being ignored, you don't necessarily get the motivation and understanding of others that you need in a cooperative. So I'll just leave it there, and the others may want to come in too.
Catalina, or others from the group who might want to add to that? I think the key thing that came up in this morning that Catalina was talking about, and that has been mentioned again here, is around that interconnectivity, that cooperation between cooperatives, if we look at the principles, as opposed to, not as opposed to, but in addition to multi-stakeholder, the one co-op that you were talking about there. I think that, I mean, we're coming up to our final sort of 10, 11 minutes really. So I think unless anybody's got anything they want to add or a question they want to pose, we'll keep an eye on the chat as well. I'm going to hand it back to our panel speakers to respond to some of those issues and maybe some of the topics and challenges and opportunities that you've raised in your discussion group. So Julia, should I hand back to you first?
Yes, thank you very much, Jen. So I will just try to reflect a little bit on what has been raised from the participants. So I I believe that the cooperative principles, although I think very fascinating and very stimulating for a cooperative, because if we look at them at the whole 7 principles, I think they are complete, but they need probably to be a little bit adjusted so as to capture also new sensitivities of many cooperatives that are being increasingly engaged in and they are increasingly care about diversity, so social inclusion, for instance. So this issue should be better should be made better explicit by the principles, I think. As far as autonomy, which was mentioned by some of the participants, I think indeed many, not with respect to credit unions, which I'm not very, with which I'm not very familiar with, but I can say a few words about many social cooperatives in Italy, so new type of social cooperatives that have lost their autonomy. They have lost their autonomy because they have been fully integrated in the welfare system and have become very dependent on public policies. So they have lost their capacity to capture new needs. And we have actually noticed a correlation between some characteristics of some social enterprises, which are mainly cooperatives, social cooperatives, and the capacity to generate innovation, social innovation, and to address new challenges. And those cooperatives that are truly multi-stakeholders, because they engage in their governing bodies, also, for instance, disadvantaged workers are better capable of taking on new responsibilities and addressing new challenges. Then about education, I think it's definitely very important to invest much more on education and help cooperatives become better aware of their strength, of their added value, and in a way encourage them to self-recognize in the cooperative movement, which is not always the case. And to do this, I think it's very important also to promote the values of the collective values of collective decision making, as opposed to some rhetorics which are sometimes quite popular among certain cooperatives about the hero leader, which don't help, I believe, strengthen this the strength of cooperatives, which is connected with their local anchorage. Then, last but not least, about scaling up. One interesting dynamic in Italy is that of establishing contracts among different cooperatives with a view to share specific, not creating consortia, which is very, very expensive because it, of course, implies creating a new organization, but establishing real contracts among different cooperatives with a view to setting up new projects, but also with a view to sharing the workforce, and especially vulnerable workers that are very difficult to employ. This very, very briefly, I tried to touch different things. I don't want to take away time from Sonja and from the last discussion. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Sonja.
Thank you, Julia, and everybody else. I mean, this we could spend months talking about this stuff, so it's kind of hard to, make key points. But I'll just say one thing, that I think the most rewarding project I'm involved in is educating cooperative leaders, because that's what we do in my center. And what that means is that we have in the same room people from worker co-ops, from food co-ops, from credit unions, and from different parts of the world. And that is key, that they talk to each other, learn from each other. And so this new cooperative motivations actually motivate the old cooperative, leaders of old cooperatives to think, what are we doing on this file, right? So social solidarity economy, new movements, new kinds of cooperatives, speaking to, as I said, the old ones. We therefore have the manager of a credit union in remote community in Canada, who actually is saying, well, we should be a community developer as a credit union. What are we doing with the money? And so they are initiators of a daycare in the community, and they sit on the board of that daycare and so on, right? So they started to think about themselves as, what can we do to actually build this community as a financial institution? And those kinds of cross learnings are not going to happen where we live, typically, as researchers. So we need to find ways, and actually among you are many practitioners, so this is great. But it points also to the cooperatives and the kinds of education needed in cooperatives. They don't send their people to graduate schools, unfortunately. So not enough co-ops are being educated, or not enough co-op leaders are being educated in this way to try and debate and discuss and think and reconsider what it is they're doing. On that, and what prompted me to this last line I want to make, the difficulty of self-interest and collective interest. There are two issues, at least in this part of the world. One, the association. Associations are so critically important, and this associationism, principle 6, yes, but really collective thinking is critically important. Yet individual cooperatives always question, what's in it for me? Why do I pay these membership fees? Is this worth to me? Where it proved critical and critically important was during COVID, that actually cooperatives in Canada could do democracy because they were in associations. Associations helped them to have AGMs online, and they helped them to figure out where the grants are coming from that support their workers and so on. So associationism is extremely important, and now I think they learned, at least many did. And another one is education. So not enough of the right kinds of education and cross learnings are happening that I think we need to kind of spend more time on.
Great, thanks Sonja. I really want to thank Guilia and Sonja for both topping and tailing this seminar, and thanks to everybody in terms of your contribution. I think there's been a lot of really interesting stuff raised, both on our virtual space, but also on the chat, and Rory's been monitoring that. I think before we say goodbye for this session, I'd just like Rory to outline the upcoming seminars.
Yes, the next seminar will be on the 14th of July, and there's two parts to that. So the first theme is innovations in legal innovations in multi-stakeholder co-ops. So we're returning to this issue of how multi-stakeholder co-ops can be formulated and accommodated within legal frameworks. We have got Ian Adderley for that, and I forget our second speaker at the moment. It's Carlo Borzaga from URIXI, who's a very eminent researcher in this area. And then after the break, the fourth theme will be on innovations in funding mechanisms. And we have got Steve Gill, who's involved in the Co-op Exchange project. We did have somebody who's a specialist in crowdfunding, but unfortunately they've got a commitment, so we need to recruit our second panelist for that. So if any of you have a suggestion of an excellent panelist who can talk about financial platform co-ops or financial platforms for the new cooperativism, then we would be very welcome to take your suggestions. Thank you, everyone. And I'd want to extend a thank you to Mary and Guilia for facilitating the first one, and obviously to Sarah and Michele for being our panelists, and in his absence, Marcelo, whose video obviously set the scene. So thank you, everybody. And the UK SCS will be making the video of these sessions available through their website. And the Research Centre will be transcribing everything. There's no reason not to share transcripts, given that everybody has given their consent to their contribution to be open. Yeah. Okay. So cheers. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.